Hi everyone. In the last section, 4.4, we were talking about maximizing profit and maximizing revenue. And we were trying to decide how many items should we produce to make the most profit, ultimately make the most revenue. We also talked about maximizing revenue in terms of selling price. In 4.5, we're going to talk about cost, and clearly we don't want to maximize our cost, but if we talk about minimizing our total cost, seems kind of ridiculous because to minimize total cost would be to not produce anything. Okay, so what we really want to look at is how do we minimize our cost per item? So how many items should we make and make to sell, and we want them to be the lowest cost per item. Okay, so here's our total cost function, 10Q plus 1,000, meaning each item costs 10. That's our variable cost, $10, and our fixed costs are $1,000. Okay, so no matter what production we have, if we have no production, we still have $1,000 fixed cost. All right, so let's talk about our total cost. So if I produce one item, it costs me $10 plus 1,000, so that's $1,010. Okay, if I produce 10 items, the total cost for producing those 10 items is $10 times 10 plus 1,000 is $1,100. For those 10 items. Okay, so let's look at it instead of total cost for all the items, let's look at our cost per item. That's what we want to look at. How much on average is each item costing us? Well, if we're producing one item, then and our total cost is $1,010, then we're saying it's costing us $1,010 per item. Whoops. So that's pretty expensive. One item is costing us $1,010. Okay, but if we make 10 items, the total cost is $1,100. We divide that up into 10 items, so we're finding the average cost per item. So 1,100 divided by 10 is going to be $110 per item. So let's continue on and see what happens. So my total cost for producing 100 items, if I substitute that into my cost function, gives me $2,000. Okay, so that means my average cost per item at a 100 item production level would be the 2,000 divided by 100, which is going to give me $20 per item. Okay, and if I produce 1,000 items, my total cost is $11,000. Whoops. What's wrong with my pen here? $11,000. So my cost per item is going to be $11 per item. So if we look at what's happening, the more items we make, as the number of items we produce increases, so does our total cost, which is understandable, okay? But what about our cost per item? So as the number of items increases, our cost per item is decreasing. Our average cost is decreasing. So we talk about our cost per item being our average cost. On average, it's costing us that amount. Okay, now why is that? Well, let's think about our average cost at our 10 item production level here for a specific example. Okay, so we're looking at, the idea is that we know okay, so we know that each item costs $10, right? So what's happening then is the fixed cost is then being divided up amongst those 10 items. So each item is $10 plus 1/10 of the fixed costs, which would be the $1,000. Okay, so if I look then at 100 items, each of those 100 items is $10, but then we're dividing up the fixed costs into 100, dividing it by 100. So each item is adding on 1/100th of those fixed costs. So that's why the average cost goes down, because we're dividing up the fixed costs amongst more items. Okay, so if I look at my original cost function, it is linear. Okay, anytime we have a linear cost function, we want to produce as many items as possible. Okay, because an increase in number of items will increase will decrease the average cost. Okay, so if the cost function is linear, we should make as many items as possible. Now, we might have a maximum that we are capable of producing due to our production line, facilities, etc. But whatever the most we can make, we should make that. And that will lower and minimize our cost per item. Okay? So make more, cost per item goes down if the cost function is linear. Okay, so let's talk about our average cost function. How do we actually come up with that function? Well, to find average cost, we take the total cost and we divide it up by the number of items. Okay, that's an average. So basically we take our cost function, we divide by Q, the number of items or units produced, and we have a name for that cost function. We use the lowercase letter a to represent average cost. Okay, let's look at another example. All right, so here I have a cost function. Once again, I notice that it is linear. Okay, because of the q to the first power. And so let's find the marginal cost now. Remember, marginal means derivative. So we want the derivative of the cost function. That's our marginal cost. So the derivative would just basically be 20 because it's linear. Okay, remember marginal cost talks about the rate at which the cost is changing per item. Okay, average cost then is basically found by taking, remember we said the cost function and dividing by the number of items. Okay, so when we do that, we say, okay, our cost function is 20Q plus 4,000, and we divide by Q. So ultimately, we can just divide each term by Q. So I'm left with 20 plus 4,000 divided by Q. So this is my function that will calculate the average cost for Q, whatever price, our production level, however many units we are producing. Okay, so let's compare those and see the differences between them. and how each of those are. Okay, so I've got my cost function, my marginal cost function, my average cost function. So if I say I'm going to produce 10 units, whoops, I'm not doing that. There we go, produce 10 units. So if I put 10 into my cost function, I get 4,200. So we're saying the total cost to produce 10 items is $4,200. Okay, marginal cost, if I put 10 into my marginal cost function, well, there's really no Q. It's always 20, so not very exciting. So we're saying marginal cost, remember, we're saying the 10th item costs $20 to make. Okay, so that's the rate at which cost is changing per item. So at the 10 item production level, the cost is $20 per item. So we're saying if we were going to produce an additional item, it would cost us $20. Okay. So my third one here, the average cost function, once again, if I plug in 10, I get 420, which we can see if the total cost is 4,200, the average cost is 4,200 total for 10 items, then what is one item? So we would divide by 10 and we get 420. So when we make 10 items, the cost is $420 per item. Okay, so let's talk about the differences between these. This calculates the total cost. Marginal cost is basically what's the cost to produce the next item. And average cost is what's the cost to produce each item. So understanding the difference between those is important. Now, what are we interested in? We're interested in what's we want the cost per item to be the lowest, right? So how do we decide production level? Should we produce more or should we produce less? So that our cost per item is at a minimum. Whoops. Okay, so let's take a look at this for a second. If I say, okay, if I'm at the 10 item production level, the next item is costing me $20. Okay, my average cost per item at that production level is $420. So I can see that my marginal cost is less than my average cost at that production level. So producing another item is going to then lower my average cost. All right. So if the cost of the next item, the marginal cost, is smaller than the cost per item, is less than the cost per item, then increasing production will lower average cost. Okay. We want our cost per item to be as low as possible. So in our last example, our cost function was linear. Here's our average cost function. We said as production increases, average cost decreases. This is the case with a linear cost function. So since my cost function is linear, then we should increase production when that marginal cost is less than the average cost. Okay, that's always the case. Produce as many as possible. Now, if the cost function is not linear, it's a little more interesting, and we will look at that situation in our next video.